From the very beginning of our species, musical communication has been a key component of prosocial cooperative behaviors, acting as a counterweight to the other newly evolved human communication system, language. Why music continues to be an essential part of human cognitive well-being in the 21st century. Hello and welcome to the Choralosophy Podcast. This is episode 138, Evolving the Musical Mind, with Dr. Alan Harvey. That quote was from the abstract of Dr. Harvey's book, which we will be discussing a little bit in this episode, called Music, Evolution, and Harmony of the Souls. In this episode, I am excited to once again go outside of the music education sphere to seek some important and relative expertise. I invited neuroscientist Dr. Alan Harvey on to give a different perspective on how music and language interact with human evolution. He is well known for a wonderful TED Talk on music and the brain, and as well for writing this fascinating book on the evolution of music in our species. In the show notes, of course, you can find information about the book, also coincidentally published by Oxford Press, who we have a relationship with here at the show. I was fascinated listening to Dr. Harvey lay out the reasons humans may have developed music as a necessary evolutionary adaptation from a common precursor of our spoken language, as well as a way to stimulate the production of oxytocin and much more. This is a in-depth lecture, if you will, on the show today, and I think you're going to want to absorb as much of this as possible and take notes. These could create some fascinating conversations and activities in your class as well. One of the moments in the show that you'll find about 20 minutes or so in is I'm going to highlight here in the introduction as well, just to whet your appetite. Dr. Harvey says, "We needed another communication system whose primary role was to bring us together in groups, to drive altruism, cooperation, social interaction, and cooperation. That is why music and dance evolved in parallel with spoken language." You've heard me talk a lot on the show so far about how literacy operates in music in a very similar way that it operates in other languages. And this is a really interesting historical perspective on why that might be the case. So enjoy and dig in, grab some popcorn. I'm excited to welcome back to the show Voce Vista Video. For those of you who are OG Choralosophy listeners, you might remember that one of the first sponsors that I talked about on the show was Voce Vista Video. Well, we're back. We have worked together with that company to make it easier for you to find resources on how to use this product and also demonstrations of the product and link right on my website that you can click in the show notes, get the discount, all of those things, because this is a software download. You actually have to pull onto your machine. There are two versions of it. There is, if you're an individual seeking to purchase this, one called Voce Vista Video, and that's the kind of the standard version of the software. If you're a school that can use your school budget to get the pro version, that's also a wonderful idea. It's a little bit more expensive. But of course, once you go through the checkout process, you can enter Choralosophy at checkout and get that 10% discount you know and love. But this is a software that will allow you to show your choir their overtone series. I use it in my classroom all the time, create fascinating lessons with this, and not only for them to just see how sound works, for the value that has, but they can also see how their voices work in creating overtones or not. They can see whether or not the sound is resonant. They can see if the sound is breathy. They can see if the vowel is actually pure. They can see, it'll show them what vowel they're actually singing. It's really, really neat. And so if you go to choralosophy.com and then /voce-vista, you can see demonstration videos that I've created there, and you can click right there in that page to purchase the software. And when you're ready to buy, use that discount code. If you listen to this show on a regular basis and appreciate the content and appreciate the quality of the conversations, whatever it is that adds value to your life, you might want to head over to the Choralosophy Patreon page and voluntarily chip in $3, $5, $8 a month towards the production costs of this show. Patreon.com/Choralosophy allows you to do that, as well as a bunch of really exciting goodies that you can find once you log on over there. We have an incredible group of producers over there at Patreon as well that are really crucial in their help, and that is Brian Long, Chandler Smith, Venture Studios, John Warner, Jonah Clixbull, Ulrika Igrain Munoz Alarcon, Angie Schilling, David Kowalczyk, Jared Hendricks, Kyle Peterson, Max Jackson, Michael Herron, Nathan Hines, Ryan Main, and Stephen Kathy Kokachik. All right, everybody, I'm here with Dr. Alan Harvey. Dr. Harvey is a neuroscientist and, as I discovered by watching him on a TED Talk, an avid musician and lover of music as well. So, Dr. Harvey, welcome to the Choreosophy Podcast.
Nice to be here.
So why don't you start out by just telling us a little bit more about you, more than just Dr. Harvey the scientist. Where do you come from? What is your interest in music, and how did you start populating those two worlds of science and music?
Well, I've been fascinated by music since I was, 3 or 4 years old. I found a sheet of music paper and I scribbled dots on it. My auntie, who was a performer, tried to play it. I wish I still had it. I had no idea what it meant, but she tried to play these dots. And I think the first LP I bought when I was 7. So I've sung in choirs. I'm currently in a mandolin trio and in the Perth Symphonic Chorus here in Perth. Actually, I'm going over to Sydney Opera House to sing a bit later in the year, which is going to be fun. Sang in Carnegie Hall. We made an album at university of folk rock, which is still available, incidentally, out there somewhere. So music's always been an incredibly important part of my life. And once or twice in my growing years, I had to make a couple of choices. Would I go the science route, or would I maybe try and go down the music path? And for various reasons that was not to take too long to explain, I chose to go down the science path. In some ways, it was safer. It was something that I think my parents would approve of more, which is interesting. But so I was born in the UK in London. I went to university school in London. I went to university at the University of Cambridge, which was a wonderful experience. Came out and did a PhD in Canberra in neurophysiology. So I was trained as a neurophysiologist, recording from the cortex, looking at how vision is processed in the brain. Then I did a postdoc in the United States in Seattle, and then the lab moved to Charleston, South Carolina. So I spent a couple of years in what I now regard as my American home, which is Charleston. I love that place dearly. I have lots of friends.
Beautiful city.
I'm still playing, and so my career was basically neuroscience. Initially physiology, then cell biology. In the last 20 years, mostly gene therapy, using molecular biology to engineer neurons or nerve cells to try and protect them after injury, mostly in the visual system or spinal cord. But during that period of time, I started to get more and more interested in why humans respond to music as universal at all. What's the point of it? And so in the late 90s, I guess the end of the last century, I started to read about that. And eventually I started to put a book together and started to give a few seminars about my ideas. And then I retired actually a bit early in order to stop teaching so that I could get this book written, which was published by Oxford University Press about 5 years ago now, 4 or 5 years ago. So I was very lucky that Oxford took it and delighted, of course, because it's such a fantastic academic press. And since then, basically everything I've done has been related to this fusion of my two of my major life stories, which is my music life story and the neuroscience, and bringing them together. And I have to say that in the sort of music field, I still feel a little bit insecure because I've sort of been more of an assembler of information by other people's work and try and come up with new ideas and thoughts and try and make a new puzzle, new picture. But of course, in my lab work, I was used to making all the data myself with my students and postdocs and so on. So I feel, a bit of an interloper into the field as a sort of a latecomer. But I think sometimes it's good to have a fresh eyes or fresh ears, looking at the data and coming in with no preconceptions and just, trawling the field to see if you can come up with some new thoughts and ideas, basically. Absolutely. And that's where I am right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I wonder, in that being fresh eyes or fresh ears into this field that um, as you told in your story just now, is was not your primary field for most of your life. Are there things that you noticed that were what you might consider innovations in those observations? Are there things that maybe where your opinions are a little bit outside of the normal in that area?
Um, I would say that one of the things that Oxford did say when I published my book was that the longest chapter in that book, which is a music book, was evolutionary biology.
Mm.
That's not typical. And the reason, and I think having a neuroscience perspective on what's different about human brains from other mammalian brains, for example, and having played for so long and understood the social, empathic, altruistic element of playing in a band with other people or singing with other people, I had that was already within me. But I really felt strongly that the way to begin this discussion about why music should not be thought of as unimportant in human existence now, but actually is a core part of what it is to be a modern, cognitively modern human being, which is I passionately believe,
Hmm.
is to go back to the beginning of the species, to track back to when the genetic data and the anthropological data would suggest that modern humans began. And with that, what I mean is really the evolution of speech, articulate language, the ability to transmit information across generations so that in the Dawkins sense of these sort of cultural memes of passing information that is additional to the genetic information that you pass on, which is when humans started to really accelerate.
Yeah.
Why then, given that language is the key to all that information processing, there's a wonderful quote by the Cambridge scholar Ian Cross: music neither ploughs, sows, weaves, nor feeds.
Hmm.
Now, you know, the opposite end of the spectrum of that is the notion from Steven Pinker that it's just musical cheesecake, auditory cheesecake. It just tickles the pleasure centers of the brain, right? So I'm thinking, no, that's not right. That doesn't feel right at all. So I went back and asked the questions that I believe that music and language evolved from a common precursor. I don't think one came before the other. I guess one of the positions I do hold is that you shouldn't use the term music other than for this species, for us. So I do have discussions with others about things like bird song and whale song and gibbon song and all that sort of thing that I think of as more of very complex vocalizations that have behavioral relevance to that species.
Hmm.
Obviously, otherwise they wouldn't have evolved. But I restrict the term music just to what we do because I think this is, I guess, where perhaps people would disagree, but I think you only need to use that term when you're contrasting it with language and linguistics.
Mm. Okay.
So why is it that we are special as a species in having these two communication streams that have evolved their own specializations? What is it that music does for us that language cannot? And if they're both universals, then they must have already been embedded in the earliest founder population of us as a species. Because when we left Africa and colonized the planet somewhere around about 70,000, 65, 70,000 years ago, we already had music and speech as part of our cognitive armamentarium.
Hmm.
They already existed.
Right.
That's where it begins. And so then the question is why? And if you can then address the question of why did we need both streams, and this is perhaps where I've come up with a suggestion that is challenging, if you like, then it's no less important now than it was 85 to 90,000 years ago. That's where I'm coming from in terms of the way I build the arguments.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
That's fascinating, and so I have a question then, and of course this be your opinion, I'm sure, but I'm interested now to hear this this idea that music and language evolved from some type of a common precursor, but then we have to think of music and language as distinct from each other uh, in the human mind or in the human species. To me, I'm really interested in where do you see possibilities that, or the similarities, I should say, between how music functions and language functions on a cognitive level. For example, I do feel strongly that when I read music, I'm going through a lot of the same types of neurological processes than if I'm reading English, but with some extra things like pitch and
Well, that
duration.
may well be. Yeah,
Do
yeah,
you have
that's
opinions
true.
about that?
Well, only in the sense that reading music is probably only 1,000 years old, maybe a bit more. The alphabet's only, I mean, the first writing is only 10,000 years old. I
Right.
think I still feel we need to go beyond that because a lot of what musicologists study now is different forms of music over the last 1,000 years and so on and so forth. That's all really interesting. But there's a fundamental substructure to all of that, which is
Yeah.
musicality. And how that impacts upon the brain, the limbic system, the reward systems, the motor systems, and so on and so forth,
Mm-hmm.
that differ fundamentally from the way language. Now, when I said they're separate, they're not distinct. In fact, I make it very clear in my writings that they are distinct, but they're not completely separate. So there's some early studies of well, it must be 15 years ago, when they looked at imaging of the brain with people either speaking or singing, and there are areas of overlap. And you'd expect there to be areas of overlap because, as you quite rightly said, there's issues of pitch, rhythm, timbre, um, loudness,
Uh-huh.
especially pitch. So language without pitch is meaningless. That's why texting is so dangerous, by the way.
Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah.
You've abstracted 99% of all the information, including facial expression. I mean, it is a seriously worrying kind of communication where people can really misinterpret. It was bad enough with emails, but it's got even worse, I think, with the compression that's going on. Anyway, be that as it may, we could do another talk on that.
Yeah.
I mean, language. There are some phonetic languages, some Asian languages, African languages, where the pitch is in a word is critical to the meaning of that word.
Mm-hmm.
If the same phoneme goes up or down in the word, it means something different. So pitch is, and there's a paper just come out, incidentally, from a Canadian group, just published this week, showing that the spectral temporal processing for speech is slightly different than it is for singing.
Mm.
And we know that there are areas in the human brain that respond to music uniquely and speech uniquely. So we know that there are separate systems, even though some of the components interact. But there's subtleties in the difference in terms of pitch processing, temporal frequency processing that relate to musicality versus speech processing, especially in Western language, maybe less so in these phonetic languages where this pitch is such a key part of the processing. So yes, they're distinct, but there's enough commonality between them, I think, to point to the fact that they probably originated from some sort of common precursor.
Mm-hmm.
And
Now, when
one of
you
the
say,
things I've suggested.
no,
So can I just finish? One of the things
Yep,
I've
absolutely.
suggested in my book is that there's a really interesting phenomenon. There are some eminent people out there who, and none of these ideas are mutually exclusive. I mean, it could be all of the things, all of the above. But there are Sandra Chahab, who's just passed away, incidentally, in the last 2 weeks, is a tragic loss. She and others have done a lot of work on early communication in children, and there are some who think that the motherese, that is the way that the mother talks to a pre-verbal infant in the first 6 to 8 months of life,
Mm-hmm.
it's not speech. It can't be, because the infants can't speak yet, but they communicate very well through facial expression, gesture, lullabies, sort of very exaggerated pitch, tonal communicative systems.
Mm-hmm.
And the babies learn pre-verbally quite quickly about communication, interaction, what works, what doesn't work, without actually using linguistic without actually using language, articulate speech.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things I've suggested is that when you watch a mum talking to a caregiver, talking to a 3 or 4 month old infant, I went out on a limb here and said, well, maybe what we're looking at is down the evolutionary tunnel back to 100,000 years ago, which is how we used to communicate with everybody as adults.
Interesting.
Right?
Yeah.
It worked. Okay. It worked reasonably well. There were people who were able to interact with each other, but they didn't have the additional cognitive architecture and the memory structures to build. And I don't know how this happened. I don't think anyone does. How you start to build an articulate structure on top of language and semantics that allows, at the same time, when you build this, you start to mentally time travel. There's a wonderful article by a New Zealander about mental time travel and how language is so important in that, because with tenses we can think about the future, now, and the past, and we can mentally jump for, when we were, what we did 25 years ago. We can also think, and this is a long answer, I know, but I'll get there. We can also think about what happens in 50 years' time. We can project forward. We can talk to our children, our grandchildren about what life will be like. But the consequence of that is, by being able to do that, we also know, and I suggest in my book, that we're the only species that knows that we're mortal, that we will die.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That we as individuals, we know that we are finite.
Wow.
And what I've suggested actually is that as we evolved that modern cognitive architecture, and along with it, this sense of mortality, which comes with things like grave goods and all the ritual that goes with dying and afterlife and so on and so forth, we needed another communication system whose primary role was to bring us together in groups, to drive altruism, cooperation, social interaction, and reward. That is why music and dance evolved in parallel to language. That's basically the whole underlying thesis of my approach to this subject.
That's amazing. If your school or church are in the market for staging products like risers, shelves, podiums, movable platforms, all of the things that you need to set your choir up for success, I would like to strongly urge you to check out StageRight. StageRight's products are sturdy, they're durable, they're easy to use. I have personal experience with the acoustical shelves and some of the platforms that they have at StageRight, and I can tell you, compared to some of the more expensive competitors, they are a really great option to fit inside of a tight school budget, but also to give you the durability and usability that you need. So check out StageRight at stageright.com. So do you, and feel free to tell me if this is just a dumb question, it's a very layperson's question, but do you subscribe to the idea or give any credence to the idea that as our brains evolved, the language and the music evolved as a result, or the other way around, that the language evolved and actually changed our brains as we were evolving?
I think it's definitely a mixture of both.
Oh, okay.
I think that there's a genetic cultural interaction that's constantly ongoing. So, I mean, Richard Dawkins, who you may have come across, a famous evolutionary biologist and biologist. One of the quotes, and I'm trying to remember in my talks, relates to the evolution of language, and basically he says that, and this is not a quote, but that the evolution of the species would never be the same again. It cannot be the same again, because you've now got cultural drivers with information being transmitted across. So the better your intelligence, the better your communicability, your ability to communicate information to your children or grandchildren. Those, in my view, they will be selected for if you learn better how to work against an adverse environment or whatever it might be. So you'd be accelerating and selecting for better communicators, and so on and so forth. We know that there's accelerated regions in the human genome that are accelerated quicker than you would expect. In fact, one of my ex-graduate students is working on that right now up in Holland. So there are certain genes and regions of genes that in humans are different, and it's like they're accelerated in terms of the way they're being. And you could argue maybe, and this is just hypothetical, that because of the cultural feedback in terms of driving those issues of communication within and across generations, that there is this acceleration of selection of certain genes. Some of those are known to be involved, for example, in the plasticity of synapses, the plasticity of connections between one nerve cell and another. And the other thing that I emphasized in the book a lot is that you can evolve a language, but a language is no good unless you have a vocabulary, and a vocabulary is no good unless you have a very advanced memory system. So our memory systems have evolved in extraordinary ways over the last 80 to 90,000 years. But it's all been selected and it's accelerating. Remember, if we're that young, we've only had about 5,000 generations of modern humans. I mean, we're 8 billion people. I mean, it's madness. Right?
Yeah.
But throughout that whole period, music and dance have remained a universal everywhere. And so, again, the notion that music is somehow peripheral to what is this, the 24/7 life of modern human beings, is absurd to me. It's as core and fundamental now because it was necessary, as I've said, to drive empathy, altruism, social cooperativity, reward, all of the things that you get in a group dynamic that you'd get when you're singing together or playing together or whatever, that brings people together. And anyone listening to this would know that if you've got a life worry, or you're stressed, or you're in the middle of some and you get into a harmonic situation with people, with music and dance as a core part of that, you forget all that other rubbish. You're having a great time. It just disappears. And you feed off this social energy that's around you. I think that's so. That's why I think it's still a key part of being a human being.
Absolutely, I completely agree, and I also fall into that camp of music being a universal language, and I think of it that way. Now, you might be surprised to hear this, but I've actually gotten into quite a few arguments with other music educators about this that will actually take the other side, that music is not a universal language, and I think it's actually a confusion in terms. Because when I say music is universal language, I'm kind of speaking along the wavelength that you're speaking, which is that it's fundamental to our species in a lot of really core ways. But people who disagree with that will make arguments about it's not universal because many cultures use it in different ways for different reasons, and that if I hear music from my culture and you hear music from outside the culture, we're going to hear different things, and therefore it's not really a universal language because we can't communicate with it in the same way that if you and I both spoke English.
Yeah, but I can't speak Finnish. I mean, what's the diff? And skin is universal, right? But it comes in different colours. So I mean, it's yes. If you've had that long to evolve in separate pockets, of course there's going to be differences.
Yep.
And there's a famous book by John Blacking called "How Musical Is Man" back in the 70s. That it was a sort of a bit of a Bible for me, really. And he and I quoted him again, saying that the modern sort of differentiation of different types of music is interesting, but it's not what he was actually getting at. He was trying to get underneath as to what the core element of musicality meant to the species, because he spent a couple of years with these tribes in Africa. He was a trained musician, but he suddenly had to realize that he'd got everything wrong. When he ended up realizing that music was absolutely embedded in everything that they did, core. And remember, if you track back, and because I'm in Australia, although I'm from the UK originally, our indigenous population, our Aboriginal population, up until colonization, although now it's called Invasion Day, but we won't go into that, 250 years ago, whatever, they didn't have a written alphabetic language. It was all an oral tradition. And most of that oral tradition was carried with a musical vehicle. Most oral traditions pre-writing are carried through this combination of word but carried and often in this mnemonic vehicle of song. Because as I said in my TED talk, a lot of people will remember lyrics of songs because there's some sort of power in attaching the lyric to that melodic vehicle.
Sorry, I just lost my camera.
It's all right. I can keep going.
Yep, you keep going.
I think it's incredibly important that we realize that that's the case, that music, it doesn't really matter if it's different in India or Burma or Africa or blues or whatever folk music. It's the core essential elements of that in relation to melodic contour, rhythm, even if the intervals change a little bit, it's still fundamentally music. And even if there are now evolved differences over a period of time and in different geographies, I don't think that's important. Well, it is important. It's interesting, but it's not what we think of as important.
Yeah, no, I agree. And like I said before, I'm definitely on your team on that topic. I completely agree. And I do want to kind of transition into another area before we kind of get too far away from that concept of the universality, because one of the things that really struck me about the TED Talk that you did was you had a portion, if my memory serves, maybe towards the end of the TED Talk, but you did a little bit of a rant, so to speak, on the importance of music education and why we in many places around the world are kind of getting it wrong, so to speak, in terms of how important we think of music education. Would you be willing to kind of share your views here with obviously a sympathetic audience?
Well, in fact, I give a lot of lectures to the music teachers, instrumental teachers. I gave a talk to the Suzuki Asia Pacific last year. So the message I always impart to teachers is, firstly, to describe my notions about the universality and why music is an absolute imperative from the perspective of human well-being, mental well-being, because that's why it exists at all as a counterweight or counterbalance to our vulnerability and our sense of individualization or mortality. It's like a counterweight. That's really where it comes from. Given that it's a driver of sociality, we know that if you put kids in schools coming from different cultural backgrounds, different educational backgrounds or religious backgrounds, different colors, and you get them to make music together, and it doesn't have to be complicated. It can be just rhythmic, it can be body tapping, it can be just blowing things and that. The way that they interact and socialize accelerates through that medium of music. There's absolutely no doubt about that whatsoever. In fact, in adults, it's well established. There's some interesting work from Oxford showing that if you get people just to randomly put them into a choir and get them to sing together, and then you ask them to talk about their attitudes towards other members of the choir, they actually have positive attitudes towards these people much faster than if they'd met them in any other circumstance. So it's called the icebreaker effect. So there's this special magic that musical communication has, and those of us who've done all that we understand it, but understanding is not explaining. Does that make sense? So,
for sure,
in the context of music, we know, for example, education, that it improves vocabulary skills, it improves sensory motor processing to some degree, short-term and working memory function. We know that. We know that it improves inhibitory control. This is a new thing that's come out, which is, kids in the ages of 5, 6, 7, we have parts of the prefrontal cortex who are involved in doing things that are socially, we think that are socially relevant, that it's not going to ostracize us. There's something odd going on in the planet right now where people are starting to behave in ways where they don't actually care whether they're liked or disliked, as long as they're powerful. But we won't go into that. But normally we learn to act in ways that don't ostracize us, that don't break us off from the group, that don't punish us, so on and so forth. And there is some evidence that kids learn inhibitory control, that is, not to initially react, but to think about what they're going to do before they act, that music training helps them to develop that inhibitory control. So in the classroom, that can be really helpful, right? In terms of kids learning, wait, no, I better not do that. I need to think about that first. Turns out that also in those studies that the better your inhibitory control, the more likely you are to hold down decent jobs later on in life, for example. So also one's hearing perception, frequency perception is better with musical training. That carries on all the way through life. So there's evidence that in aging with hearing loss, that if you've had musical training, that your ability to discriminate speech in noisy environments, for example, is better, which is really useful.
Makes sense. Yeah.
There's some evidence that it can act as a buffer. So if you're an instrumental player, for example, we know in the brain that instrumental players have increased connection between the two hemispheres through the corpus callosum. So there was a wonderful study on 9 pairs of identical twins, so their genes were the same. One of those twins played piano all their life, not professionally, but just played. The other twin didn't. And they put them into scanners, MRI scanners, and compared the brains of the musical twin with the identical non-musical twin. And consistently, the brains of the musical twin were different. Same genes. And the areas that were different, you might expect, was a bit of motor cortex, because of all of this, parts of the cerebellum, which is involved in the control of digit movements and rapid finger movements, auditory cortex, of course, maybe, but also the corpus callosum, which is the massive fiber bundle that connects the two hemispheres. So we know that, that the circuitries of musicians are different. What is not clear is how much musical training is needed. Do you need just a year or two? Do you need, that's still, I think, a work in progress, and exactly what's best and how much. But the fact that you've got these different interconnections means that some people have suggested that you have, when memory starts to fail or things start to not work quite as well, you've got alternate circuits, different routes of access that you can use to sort of buffer that loss. Now, if all that's true in terms of enhanced hearing, some protection against memory loss and aging, some protection in terms of that happens 50 or 60 years on from your primary school teaching or your teaching in grade, early grades. That's what I try and tell the teachers, because it's not just in terms of some of the better communication, social skills that come along with it during childhood and adolescence, but that you're teaching people for a lifelong learning. And if it means that when they're in their 60s and 70s and 80s, there are still benefits from that early training, seems to me that that's a really saleable item in terms of going to the guys who run the schools or the guys who provide the funding, saying this is a lifelong benefit. This is not wasting time. This has lifelong influences on the well-being and the welfare of these kids.
Yeah,
that's what I try to sell. And the teachers, I think, that I've lectured to, I think, respond to that quite well, because it's something that they can use when they're making their arguments about more money, more funding, or whatever it might be, which is actually really what we need.
Yeah, no, I agree here too. And I'm just going to actually throw out another, another common music educator thing that I've come across, an idea that I've come across that kind of makes it hard to make that case, because I agree that there are so many benefits out there that have been studied and you can demonstrate, and they are there. But there is sometimes a resistance in music education towards the idea that we should be teaching music for any other reason other than just because we should be teaching music. It has its own inherent value, and that should be obvious to everyone. And so what I kind of get frustrated with sometimes is that, well, not everyone knows that music is obviously beneficial if they've never experienced it. Sometimes you have to rattle off a bunch of science to convince people that it's a valuable thing. And I think maybe sometimes music educators, we don't want it to feel scientific. We want it to feel like it's only the emotion. It's the emotion that drives everything. So how would you maybe encourage us to think about the difference between the the cold neuroscience, so to speak, and the and the emotional aspect of music? Do we need to separate them at all?
No, I don't think you do at
Mm-hmm.
all. In fact, the neuroscience underpins all of those reward emotional features anyway. So music has a gold pass to the limbic system in terms of memory, in terms of evoking autobiographical memories. So if you look at what happens with people with dementia, for example, now there's more and more work being done on the impact of communicating with people with dementia via music and song. And people would have, listening to this, would have seen stuff on YouTube about demented patients who are essentially just sort of frozen, or not, and then you start singing a song that they know or a piece of music they know. They suddenly open up, they remember all the lyrics, their whole attitude changes. There's some wonderful, heartwarming stuff out there about this. And clearly what's happening there is that the power of music to drive autobiographical memories is so profound. And this is, I think, to do with learning and the whole notion of music as a carrier of an oral tradition of who you are as a tribe, who you are as a group, what your land is, what your cultural heritage is, and so on. So going back again 40, 50, 60. Remember, the earliest bone flute that we know of is about 45,000 years old. So this is a very ancient, in our species, form of communication. All of those, the way that and mostly the songs or the tunes that these individuals respond to are ones that they heard that had real emotional significance to them. And that makes sense, because from a neuroscience perspective, it's those emotional memories that are the ones that are really locked in to the circuitry, are the ones that are perhaps the most easy or readily accessible later on when memory starts to fail. So there'll be things that they learn in their adolescence. It might be something that was played at their wedding. It might be the song that when they first met their husband or partner or whatever it might be, that had special significance to them. Those are the sorts of memories that really, or tunes that evoke and reawaken lost, buried memories. And for 5-10 minutes, they're alive again. You must have seen.
Yeah.
So, and the other thing I would say is that I have argued, and I will continue to argue, that this notion of art and science, and I said this in my TED talk, is a recent phenomenon. It really began in the Renaissance, I guess in the 16th century. It was sort of, if you go back to when the Royal Society developed in London in the 17th century, where they started to use language or which was scientific. It was different from, so these two cultures where we suddenly evolved this certain way of thinking about science and engineering and so on, and this way of thinking about so-called art, which is somehow is a different. I think that's just rubbish. It's a modern, relatively modern sort of separation, and music was a part of, as I said again in the TED talk, of everyone's education up until 15th, 16th century. It was core part, including mathematics, astronomy, music, medicine. And the Greeks actually put music in their useful category of education, not their non-useful.
As it should be. Yeah.
Yes, it should be. So I don't see that one should be frightened of thinking of music in a scientific context, because clearly everything that we do, our emotions, our reward centers, our biology, has an underpinning in the science of how the brain works or how the body works. You just have to think of them as a continuum. I don't think we need to separate them out at all. And I don't think it should be something that should worry anybody. In fact, the scientific explanations as to why certain things happen the way they do, I would have thought should lend more power to argument than less. Although I know there's this kind of an anti-science movement out there, and people sort of, let's not get into vaccines and stuff. Sorry, but there's all this other stuff out there. It's not where I'm coming from. I actually just wrote an interesting review. I think it's a good review, if I might say so, on this hormone called oxytocin.
Yeah.
Now, and I got more and more interested in this, and so I did a 3 or 4 month hunt for this. It was published a couple of years ago now. How the neurobiology of oxytocin relates to human musicality. And the more that I researched this, and the more that I found what oxytocin does in humans, and what music does in humans, it kept doing this, and I thought, heavens above, there's so much in relation to what we think of the neurobiology of music that is associated with the neurobiology of oxytocin. Now, remember that oxytocin is the hormone that's released by women, and I learned it as a physiologist, for lactation and childbirth. It's to do with childbirth. But it's also critically important in attachment. So the bonding between the mum and the child, oxytocin is a key player. And that's well established. And in fact, if you have a mutation in the receptor for oxytocin, in fact, that can be associated with less interaction between a mum and an infant. Wow. Now, in animals, oxytocin is key to raising pups, and the pups, the interaction between the dam or the mum and the pups. Absolutely key. And it turns out that in humans and in animals as well, if you interfere with this peptide or its receptor, you interfere with social learning, the ability to learn in social contexts. So it's been done in rats where they specifically delete the receptor in certain parts of the brain, and the animals can't socially learn anymore, right? Now, in humans, if you give oxytocin, you can give it as a nasal spray. People become more cooperative. Oh, yeah, more social, more group interactive with the group. All sorts of things that relate to social altruism, cooperativity, empathy. Because one of the other things that I do sort of have disagreements with teachers, and I shouldn't, because they know their business. Two things. One is, I entirely agree with you about. 3 years ago, I gave a talk to the instrumental teachers of Western Australia, and it was all about curriculum. It was all about grade. In terms of teaching grade 7, grade 8, which is higher than I ever got. There was only one pair of young female teachers, probably in their early 30s, who were focusing on improvisation for their instrumental students. Yeah. And I thought that was very sad because, again, as Blacking said, the notion of competition in music is antithetical, or it cuts against the whole evolutionary background of why music exists at all. It drives social cooperativity. So I do have this problem. I understand why people want to learn to be a great violinist or a great pianist or whatever, but actually, in a sense, that's irrelevant to human musicality. It's. I know that people want to do it, but the notion of having competitions, as Blacking said, you can have a competition where you're trying to be the best in sport or something, but music somehow isn't there. It's not like that. Yeah. So I have this problem with the notion of high-level instrumental training and competitiveness versus the social fabric that is musicality. Do you know that everyone?
No, I do. I know what you mean. Yeah. If I could, I'd like to kind of respond to that. So, because I hear that argument too a lot, especially in the U.S. We do music competitions all the time. I do exactly one every year, and that's because I have to do that one. Like it's related to our school's activity association, and so like we kind of have to do it. But I agree with you again here that music competition is antithetical to why music exists. And now to address the issue of why somebody would want to be a virtuosic violinist or singer or whatever, I think those things are wonderful, and I support those pursuits, and I think that they are amazing. But the way I would square that round or put the square in the round hole, so to speak, is that that's not why music education exists, though. Our job is not to find the diamond in the rough violin player or the next Pavarotti. That's not the reason we have music classes. We have music classes for all the things you've been talking about, which is the universal fundamental value of cooperation, neurological development. I believe that's a big part of it as well. I think I see a lot of science around that as also. And so I agree with you that music competition is a very strange thing that has become very, very popular in the world. And so, yeah, I definitely would not disagree with that. I would like to, on the way out as we wrap this up, talk a little bit, since you mentioned at the beginning that you have a book that's published that kind of covers some of these things, and it's Oxford University Press. Could you tell us a little bit more about that? What's it called? Where can we find it? Is it still in print?
Because it's still in print. It's in print in paperback.
Okay.
It's called Music, Evolution, and the Harmony of Souls.
It's a great title.
Some of the people in the US didn't like this Harmony of Souls thing but I insisted because I thought it was exactly what the book's about. It's got a great cover. It covers, yes. I mean, if I got an opportunity to revise it, there's some new data in the last 3 or 4 years that would kind of amplify some of the stories, but I don't think the whole message has changed. So I talked a bit about mortality and stuff. So there is a chapter in that book called "The Consequences of Owning a Modern Mind," and that's really about that, because that's in a sense the core of the book. But there's a chapter on music education, which could be improved a lot now. There's also a chapter on music therapy. And the other thing, I guess, that I haven't mentioned is some suggestion that we know that music therapy is becoming in a few weeks' time, I've been asked to chair the presidential symposium. I'm not going to Boston, I'm doing it online, for the American Neuropsychiatry Association.
Okay.
I got this email from the president of the American Neuropsychiatry Association saying, would I chair his presidential symposium? And I emailed back and said, really? He said, I saw your TED talk, which was great. So it's the first presidential symposium in neuropsychiatry on music therapy. I've got a great guy, Michael Thorpe from Toronto, St. Louis in Boston, who's a relatively young gun on autism and that sort of thing. Guy in Norway who's Christian Gold, who's working on dementia, schizophrenia, depression, and the role of music in enhancing those things. So I'm really excited about it. But why I mention it is that music isn't just about education. And there is some suggestion that if you had some music training at school, then you respond better to music therapy later in life.
Okay.
Whether it be an Alzheimer's, stroke, spinal cord injury, neurotrauma, whatever it might be. We know that it's important in autism, in helping to treat autistic children on the spectrum. We know it's important in dyslexia. Yeah. So there's a whole range of things that relate to music and health that we haven't really covered, because I guess we've been talking about normal population, but the population isn't normal. It's a variant, and there's a bigger picture here about the role of music and music training, not just in terms of normal aging, but in terms of things when you start to go wrong. That with music therapy, that'll become more and more powerful, more and more appreciated. And if it's true that having some early music education or training makes you more responsive to those kind of therapeutic approaches later on in life, there's just another reason why it's absolutely essential to do something about it.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. That's beautifully said. So I have to, before we sign off, I have to tell you something kind of funny here.
Hang on.
You're fine. Oh, yeah. You got, because you've got your background blurred. That's why.
Yeah, well, I don't want to show my CDs, do I?
Yeah, after we sign off.
Anyway, that's what the cover looks like. It's called
great
Music
cover.
Evolution and Harmony of Souls. Yeah,
it's a great cover.
Sorry.
No, you're fine. So what we'll do is we'll put in the show notes a link to the book, and this is the funny story I was going to tell you before we signed off. But I did not do my homework well enough, apparently, before inviting you on the show. I didn't realize you had a book published by Oxford. On this show, I have an Oxford Press series.
Oh,
um,
right. Okay.
of interviews of various people who have things published with Oxford. So I'm going to let them know that we did this talk, and they'll probably help us get the word out about
Okay, thanks.
about the
And the other
episode.
thing, yeah, the other thing, I did do a podcast for them that people might want to access. I don't think it's been
Uh-huh.
accessed for a while. Oxford asked me to do a podcast. Uh, well, not a podcast. It was a blog. Sorry, a blog. And I
Yep.
did one called Schubert and Sandy Denny. I'm a big fan of Schubert, but there's a woman called Sandy Denny who passed away far too young. She was probably the greatest English folk singer, in my opinion. She sang in a band called Fairport Convention and wrote some wonderful songs. And I
Mm-hmm.
discovered that that they both died at the age of 31. And I discovered that a lot of the lyrics or the words that Schubert used were so similar to the songs that Sandy Denny wrote. And I found that from my own personal perspective, they evoked exactly the same thoughts of joy, but also melancholy, all at the
Yeah.
same time. If you understand that feeling.
Mm-hmm.
So I wrote a blog called Schubert and Sandy Denny, and yeah, I think it's a good blog. If people are interested, it might introduce them to the music of Sandy Denny, because she wrote some of the most beautiful songs that maybe modern people in the United States haven't heard, but they're worth trying to listen to.
That's
There's
wonderful.
one song in particular called "Who Knows Where the Time Goes." That
Mm.
if anyone's watching this, go and look up "Who Knows Where the Time Goes," and that's the song I'm going to have played at my funeral. So that's how much it means to me.
Oh, that's great. That's awesome. Well, Dr. Harvey, this has been a blast, and I really appreciate learning from you. We got a massive amounts of information to download, and I'm sure lots of people will enjoy processing through all of that. And like I said, we'll link the copy of your book to the show notes, and this will be a great way to spread the word about that.
Okay, my
Awesome.
pleasure.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Harvey.
To you too. More power to you.
Well, thank you.
Take care.
Thank you, as always, for sticking around to the end of an episode. I hope that you had fun getting all science-y with me. I really enjoyed hearing from Dr. Harvey his ideas about how and why our species developed this special thing that you and I all love, and that we all love and maybe take for granted, that we just are humans who can sing. But hearing him explain why this might have taken place from an evolutionary perspective was fascinating. And it caused me to reflect on a lot of things about us as humans and how we communicate and the value of music. So I hope you enjoyed that. As always, on the way out, don't forget to like, share, go to patreon.com/Chorilosophy, sign up there and chip in to help us underwrite the costs of the show. And of course, use the Chorilosophy checkout codes at ryanmain.com, graphitepublishing.com, sightreadingfactory.com, mymusicfolders.com, and now back on the roster is Voce Vista Video. You can get that amazing resonance imaging software, and you can use Chorilosophy at all of those places to get a discount, which helps your budget and helps provide your classroom with great materials. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time.